My mother smiled at me at the Christmas table and told me the house was finally sold. "We finished buying your grandmother's house last month," she said, waving a glass of wine. "You've never been in a good mood." My sister laughed into her napkin and said, "Good, you've messed up her little study." 11 faces turned to see me collapse. But I didn't. None of them knew that the name of that farm was in my bag next to my chair, and in 90 seconds, that name had made Christmas dinner the quietest room in the area. Welcome to the silent drama where ordinary people meet unexpected families and interact with steady, powerful energy. If a story makes you pause your coffee and say, "Okay, you've come to the right place." My name is Simon Finch, I'm 34 years old, and I work in the events industry on the farms surrounding Cedar Hollow. Leave a comment and tell me where you saw this story, and don't forget to record yourself explaining how I got to that table. I have to go back about a year. It was a Tuesday in February, and I was going through the records of the Hurtley Dairy Lodgers family when I received the call. My grandmother Opal had had a terrible night. I was the one calling. I was the one calling the whole time. Not my mother, who lives 20 minutes out of town. Not my sister, Brooke, who lives closer. It was me, because for 8 years I'd been the one driving her to the farmhouse on Cedar Hollow Road with her medications, tax forms, groceries, and her morning thermos of coffee. I shut down my laptop, left a note on the office door, and walked across the frozen fields. When I arrived, Opal was sitting upright in her bed, smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She held my hand for a moment and didn't say much. Then she reached into her bedside table drawer and gave me a small key. It was the key to an old tin recipe box she'd kept in the kitchen before I was born. When the time came, she said, "You know where to look." I asked her what she meant. She patted my hand and told me to drink my coffee before it got cold. I put the key in my coat pocket and didn't think much of it. I thought they were tired of talking, like old people say when the medication has dulled their temper. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things that year, but I didn't understand any of it until the house was sold. That country house was the only place where I ever felt I belonged. I grew up in the city, in my parents' spotless country house, where every conversation felt like a performance review. But during the summer months, I was a member of the Opal Co-op. She taught me how to shell beans on the porch and how to read food bills so the cooperative wouldn't make a profit. She'd spread out the farm receipts on the kitchen table and make me count the columns aloud. "Numbers don't lie, Simon." She says that's what people do. That's how you learn numbers. In that kitchen, I decided what I wanted to be. Because my parents didn't help me with my university studies, and because Opal gave me her savings to pay the rent, I opened Finch & Company, an accounting firm, in a room above a hardware store when I was 22. My mother thought it wasn't for us, and my sister thought it was boring. Opal thought it was the best thing any member of our family had ever done. I went there weekly, and my mother came twice a year, usually to inquire about the land's value. Brooke would come on holiday and leave early. I don't say this to feign sacrifice, but because of something Opal said during our last bountiful harvest together, when we were digging the soil with our fingernails in the garden. She looked at the house, then at me, and said clearly, "This place is for those who remain." I laughed. I told her not to say that. She still had years ahead of her. She didn't argue. She smiled, as if she knew something I didn't, then went back to her tomatoes. I should have asked her what she meant. It hadn't occurred to me. I thought we had plenty of time. 3 days after Opal gave me that key, she died in her sleep. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday, and I had planned everything. I chose her favorite hymn, ordered flowers, wrote the obituary, and stood at the door thanking her neighbors who had known her for 60 years. My mother, Sharon, wore black and received condolences like a queen. My father, Raymond, stood silently beside her. That was his nature. Brooke spent the reception engrossed in her phone. I noticed that grief made everything both noisy and quiet at the same time. What I remember most is mathematics, not grief, but mathematics. At the reception, before the dishes had even cooled, my mother leaned over and asked me what the country house offered. I thought she was mistaken. Then Brooke picked up her camera and wandered around the house, taking pictures of the attic, the blanket, and her grandfather's clock, talking about prices as if she were at a house auction. That clock has value, she said. And the land, too. The land is real money. My father examined his shoes. No one asked who fed old Opal's cat. No one asked where her gardening tools should be kept. They only asked about their worth. And standing in my grandmother's kitchen, I felt something cold sink into my chest, standing beside the metal box she'd told me about. It was grief, I told myself. Families are strange about death, I told myself. Not what they say. I thought the hardest part was over, that nothing could be worse than losing her. I was wrong. The hardest part was yet to come. It began with a phone call about the will. In April, my cousin Wade called a family meeting to read the will. Wade is a colleague on my mother's side, a part-time real estate agent who runs a tax and property registration office in 2 cities and always has a faint scent of cigarettes and cologne. The meeting wasn't in a lawyer's office, but at my parents' kitchen table, with a coffee cake and a file. That should have been my first clue. Wade, wearing his glasses, said that Opal had bequeathed everything to my mother: the house, the land, the accounts. Her beautiful daughter-in-law, who had looked after me in recent years, had read the will. My mother wiped her eyes. Brooke squeezed her hand. My name wasn't on the document at all. Not as a beneficiary, not as a witness, not even as a note. You weren't mentioned in the will, dear, my mother said. A faint smile played at the corner of her mouth. I sat perfectly still. I'm good at sitting still. But 2 things were screaming inside me. The first was that beautiful girl, Opal, who held and held instead of writing. She and my mother had been like 2 kittens for 30 years. The second was the signature. I had seen my grandfather sign hundreds of documents. That signature was precise, even serene. Opal, whom I buried, couldn't hold a spoon, let alone sign her name clearly, for weeks. The date below read, "This will was made 3 weeks before her death." 3 weeks! I didn't say a word. I thanked Wade for his time, took the piece of coffee cake I hadn't eaten, and returned to my office, my hands on the steering wheel, my mind racing with math. This is the nature of family accounting. People think they only account for what they contribute and forget to notice what they lack. That night, I sat at my desk and prepared everything I knew, just as Opal had taught me how to manage family accounts. 2 years earlier, I had taken her to the attorney's office at the county center. She told me she was sorting things out and asked me to wait in the hallway, which was typical of her. An hour later, she emerged with a sealed envelope and a business card she kept in her purse. I didn't see the documents, but I knew they were there. How did Wade become famous for a will drawn up by an estate lawyer 2 years earlier, 3 weeks before her death? Wills can be updated, but Opal hadn't left that house for 6 months. She couldn't drive to the Department of Education office, and Wade hadn't even entered the farm yet. If only I'd known. I called him the next morning and asked him directly when my grandmother had signed the new will. It soon became clear. She asked me to come over. "Last-minute changes," I said. "It always happens, Simon." I asked him who had seen it. He said he would check the file. The notary public is the one who verifies whether anyone has seen the will, and he's the one who will tell you anything. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat there for a long time, looking at the corner of my desk where I keep things I don't lose. I remembered his ID card. 2 years ago, he simply placed the Opal card in my hand in the showroom lobby. I took it without hesitation. Margaret Horan, a lawyer specializing in inheritance law. Before contacting the lawyer, I did what was logical. I asked my family for the truth. I went to my parents' house and asked to see the deed of sale, not the WDE coffee cake file. My mother's expression changed completely. "Why do you need this?" she asked. "I just want to read," I said. "I love books. Reading documents is what I do." Then she picked up the tool she'd used her whole life. She'd made a victim of her own making. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice trembling. "Your grandmother's lying on the floor, and you two are fighting over money." Brooke suddenly appeared at the door just in time. "Don't mess this up, Simon. It's nice of you to make everything revolve around you." My father gazed at the wallpaper. I looked at all three of them and understood what I should have understood years ago. They weren't confused. They weren't upset by the injustice. They had a plan. The plan was for me to remain quiet and shy. So I was quiet, but not in the way they wanted. I went back to my office and didn't call my mother to apologize because, for the first time, I had nothing to apologize for. They thought I was covering for them. They thought the bookish girl would always remain quiet, because my job was always to keep quiet. What I'd forgotten was what I do to earn a living. I spend my entire day trying to find the number someone has been so hard to hide. I find it in the middle of the night. I find it on days that don't match my dates. And it was a day that didn't match my dates, a confession my cousin couldn't explain. So the next morning, I picked up the phone and called Margaret Horry. Margaret Howren's assistant helped me call my grandfather by name. He had already mentioned his name before the lawyer spoke. But Margaret was cautious on the call, as good lawyers do, and asked me to come in person and bring my ID. We arranged for the following week. Meanwhile, I did what I always do when I'm scared. I gathered the facts. I realized that the estate proceedings were moving very quickly. My mother had filed a petition with the court as executor of the will, a procedure that is completed quickly when no one objects. The court reviews the will written on the cover and only verifies the signature if an heir objects, and no heir had objected. The required notice was sent to an old postal address I had provided years before, so it arrived just as the objection period was about to expire. Margaret heard nothing, as no one was required to notify the lawyer who had previously drawn up the will. On paper, the Department for Education document appeared valid, and the will was validated accordingly. The country house and land were up for sale to the heirs, and were going to the highest bidder. That evening, I drove to Cedar Hollow Road and parked at the end of the long, gravel-paved road. The house stood proudly there in the darkness of the night, the front porch of the Opal hanging as usual. I imagined strangers passing through those rooms. I imagined one of them demolishing her garden to build a swimming pool, and I made a promise to myself there in that cold. Whatever the law ultimately says about that forged signature, proving it will take months, and the house will have been gone long ago. I couldn't stop the sale in time, but there was nothing stopping me from buying it. If you've ever seen someone part with something precious they never deserved, you know exactly the silence that fell over me. It wasn't defeat. It was a decision. I have to pause here for a moment. You know that feeling in your chest when you see every date, every figure, every long night, and the people who disappeared when you see them and you decide they deserve the prize. Stay with me, because... Then it surprised me. Click the subscribe button to read the rest of the story. People expect anger to sound serious. It sounded like my legal notebook. The night I decided to buy the house, I sat at the kitchen table over the desk and wrote a list, because lists are what I think they are. On one side, I wrote down what I knew. The will was undoubtedly forged, but the sale was already underway. My family had spent money they hadn't yet received. On the other hand, I wrote about what I could control. I wrote about their behavior, not the speed of the legal proceedings, but only about my own actions. It was approved, it was legal, and it was done in the correct order. My mother's voice kept echoing in my head. You were never mentioned in the will. I allowed it. I didn't get rid of it. I let it fester and feed on it, because anger, you see, is anger that can be channeled. Then I started reading. I read everything I could find about how estates are sold when the executor needs money. I found the word that changed everything. Auction. The estate management did not conduct a quiet private sale to a pre-selected buyer. To expedite the proceedings and ensure fairness in court, the land was put up for public auction. The auction was open to the public, to anyone with money and a willingness to pay £1. My mother thought she was selling her mother-in-law's house to an unscrupulous investor. She had no idea the auction house would be open to me. I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Peace. Not quite. A purpose. I had a plan to get a number, to build, and for the first time in months, I wasn't doing the work. I was doing the calculations no one else knew about. Margaret Howren's office smelled of old paper and good coffee. She was a slender woman in her late 50s, wearing reading glasses on a chain and holding a handkerchief. I placed my will on her desk. She looked at me, then at me again, and I felt a comforting touch on her shoulder. "You look like her," she said. Then she opened a thick file. She told me that my grandmother had come to her 2 years earlier and written a will. 2 of Margaret's employees witnessed the signing, and it was officially published. In the document, Opal bequeathed the country house and the surrounding 10 acres of land to Simon, which then passed to me. Margaret read the document aloud, and I had to stare out the window for a while. The bills were paid to the family, but the house was now mine, officially documented and duly signed. Then I told him about Wade's account, the permanent signature on the deceased's body, 3 weeks before the appointment, and reading the text aloud at the kitchen table. Margaret's expression became rigid and professional, the way lawyers look when they're angry. She said I had made a will for the operation. No one had spoken to me about revoking it. A later, valid will could supersede an earlier one, but it had to be in effect. I clicked on the file. If you doubt your niece's document, the will on the court records is a forgery, and any action taken based on it is contestable. I asked the obvious question: where is the original signed copy of her real will? Margaret had a similar copy on file, but she insisted on keeping the murdered Opal safe at Cedar Hollow Bank. Margaret said that to open that box, you needed a key and a document that Opal had kept. A key? A box. I felt like a can of cold soup was going to hit my head. The next morning, I drove one last time before heading to the farm. The estate company hadn't closed yet. I still have the key Opal gave me years ago. The back door, which locked if it wasn't opened. I went inside, and the scent greeted me first. A mixture of lavender, wood smoke, and silk. Everything was in its place. I went straight to the kitchen. The shelf above the stove held the metal recipe box that had stayed there my whole life. I took the small key she had placed in my hand in February out of my coat pocket and agreed. Inside, beneath an index card stained with decades' worth of dust and cake, I found 2 things. The first was a flat brass key in a small envelope with a handwritten address on it: Cedar Hollow Bank, P.O. Box 114. The second was a sealed letter. My name was at the top of her circular letter, just Simone. I stood in that kitchen with them, my hands trembling like I'd never seen them before. I knew what the brass key was for. The safe deposit box, the first will, the thing that could destroy my family's entire history. But the letter was different. The letter was her voice. I wasn't ready to listen yet, so I did something completely irrational. I took the bank key and put the letter in my pocket, keeping it for 3 days without opening it. Once you uncover certain facts, you can't undo them. I believe everything I wrote was meant to ask me something, and I wanted the strength to do so before I even read what it was. While I was gathering the courage to open the letter, I did something that gave me the will to persevere. I started a company. Not because I'm good at everything, but because I had to bid on that house without my mother seeing my name and without raising the price. So I did what most buyers do, without a second thought. I registered a limited liability company called Cedar Hollow Holdings. The company name only appears in public records. The law still requires me to register as a beneficial owner with the Federal Register, which I did because I comply with the law. But when my family looks at the company documents, all they see is a company they've never heard of before. They never connected him with the girl he wrote about. Then came the hardest part: the money. The country house and 10 acres were valued at around $215,000. Not a huge amount in the city, but a hefty sum when you put the books in a hardware store. But I'd been careful for 12 years. I'd saved a considerable amount in this business. I inherited a small sum from my grandfather, which I never used because Opal advised me to save it for something important. I qualified for a company mortgage to cover the remaining amount. Since I never allow a client to overinvest, I spent 2 nights in my office sorting through all the figures. It was hard work, but it was organized. And there was another thing that worked for me, a purely mathematical calculation. My mother desperately needed the money, which meant she lowered the minimum price to close the sale quickly. The low minimum price was a golden opportunity. I was determined to seize it. In the midst of all this planning, Brooke called to brag. Little did she know she was bragging. She thought she had good news. She'd paid a deposit for a new SUV. It was installed, she said. The third row worked. She said she was paying off her share of my grandfather's estate, money that hadn't been settled yet. I asked her politely if it was wise to do this before the sale was finalized. Then she said, with great delight, that it hadn't cost her a thing. Good heavens, if you'd allow me, Grandma, you'd be wasting your time in that dusty little office. It was the same line my mother had so readily used, wearing a slightly different dress. You'd been wasting the 8 years I spent driving to that farm as if it were garbage. It was as if preserving someone's books, their friendship, their honor at the end of their life was insignificant. I felt an overwhelming urge to defend myself, to recount every date and every appearance. But I didn't realize it. I finally understood that you don't justify your worth to those who have decided you have nothing. We'll see, I said. There was a brief silence on the line, as if she expected more argument and didn't know what to do without it. Then she said, anyway, changing the subject to getting dressed. After we ended the call, I sat with my tea cold and thought about the auction. I only had 11 days left. I considered parting with a car full of money, which would have been the most expensive mistake of her life. For the first time, I allowed myself a small smile about it. Only in my kitchen. The night before I met Margaret, I finally opened my grandmother's letter. I made the tea I hadn't yet drunk, sat in the chair by the window, and placed my thumb under the seal. Her handwriting filled 2 pages, and her final, forged signature remained in its suspicious place. She wrote as she spoke, not with empty words. She told me she knew. Sharon knew she was in trouble. She knew about the second loan and the failed projects. I knew that when she left, hands would reach for the house before the flowers arrived. I'd expected it for years. She wrote, "Your mother loves money as much as some people love whiskey, and she makes up any story she can find." Then she told me what she'd done. The real will was in a safe deposit box in Margaret's name, a house bequeathed to me in writing. That's when I could repeat the line I'd read over and over in my sleep. If they tell you you're not mentioned in my will, put this letter on the table and let the newspaper do the talking. Simon, don't argue with them. You were never good at it, and it's not your strength. Numbers are your strength. Silence is your strength. The house goes to the one who leaves. That's you. You are always there. I sat there for a long time. Then it came. Not the beautiful crying we see in movies, but the ugly crying that comes over us when someone from the past reaches out and stares at us all the time. Then I wiped my face, folded the letter in its stained cream, and put it somewhere safe. Because I didn't just buy a house, I followed the clear, final instructions of the only person who believed in me. Let the paper do the talking. 2 days later, Margaret and I opened safe deposit box number 114 at Cedar Hollow Bank. Opal thought of this room too. Years ago, when I was a university student, she quietly placed me in the box. My signature was on file at the bank, so when she died, the box would never be locked, and I would be able to open it without waiting for a court date. I had the brass key. Inside was a thin file containing the original copy of her actual will, with her signatures and seals intact, notarized and written 2 years prior. Margaret sat at the small meeting table in the bank next to a copy of the investigation document and put on her glasses. She didn't speak much for a while. Then she began pointing out the dates, the statements of testimony, and the names of 2 people on the copy of the document whose signatures no one could clearly read, which Margaret said in a tone as close as possible to someone who had seen the original document. She'd seen forged documents before, and they always made the same mistake. They went to great lengths to make everything look perfect. She said that even an original signature of a sick woman had failed, and this would continue. She explained the solution simply. We could reopen the estate file, present the original will, and file a fraud lawsuit. If the court agrees, the forged will can be invalidated and everything done under it challenged. But she warned me it would be a long road, that it would take months, maybe even a year, for my family to fight every step of the way. At the same time, she warned me the auction would go ahead as scheduled. The house would be sold, so I told her we were fighting on 2 fronts. She raised her eyebrows. I told her my plan. He founded the company, bought the house directly at auction, and then pursued the fraud case to uncover the whole truth. Margaret took off her glasses and looked at me for a long moment, almost smiling. "Your grandmother would have loved that," she said. Then she picked up her pen and we got to work. The auction took place on a cold October morning in the county building, in a conference room filled with folding chairs and roasted coffee. I didn't attend in person, that's the crux of the matter. Instead, I sent someone who could bid without raising suspicion, a trusted partner sent from Margaret's office on behalf of Cedar Hollow Holdings. I sat in the parking lot, phone in hand, my heart pounding, as I typed in the maximum allowed on the ticket. Mum and Brooke were inside. I watched them walk in, dressed up, celebrating. I sent updates to Margaret's partner. The bidding was as low as I'd expected. The minimum price had been reduced for a quick sale, then it was gone. The local farmer eager for the land, the wealthy businessman, and the quiet man in the smart suit all nodded as the company's figures patiently climbed on Tuesday. The price had surpassed $220. My family was pleased to learn this later. Every increase meant more money for them, and they didn't know who was encouraging them or why. At $238,000, the room fell silent. The gavel fell, and the farm on Cedar Hollow Road was now owned by Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC. My phone rang. "Your company was sold. Congratulations, Miss Finn." I sat in that cold car, my hand over my mouth, and made a sound that was half laugh and half cry. My mother emerged from that building minutes later, smiling and laughing, secretly counting the money and complaining to Brooke about the company that had stolen our funds. She walked to within 30 feet of my car and didn't look back. She thought she had won. She thought she had sold her mother-in-law's house to a stranger for a top price. Little did she know, she had sold it to a grandson who had sworn to have no share in the inheritance. When people were eager to spend money, they spent it lavishly. My mother took the lion's share, and I later learned that most of it went directly toward paying off the second mortgage and debts she'd hidden from my father for years. Brooke paid off her SUV and was planning a vacation. My father, on the other hand, took everything he was given and didn't thank anyone. They split the money over dinner. I wasn't invited, which suited me perfectly, because every dollar they put on the table was a dollar I paid. The night the money was transferred, I sat in my office above the hardware store and placed the new document on my desk under the lamp. The owner of the record, the country house, and 10 acres of land on Cedar Hollow Road, Cedar Holdings, LLC, my company, my home, my grandmother's home, to the right place. And none of them know it. I want to tell you the truth about something, because this is the part people misunderstand. I didn't feel victorious that night. I was tired and sad, and I watched all this happen and felt a strange sympathy for the woman who was fighting for me from beyond the grave. Victory would come later. That night was quiet. I traced the address on the document with my finger, remembering the porch swing and the weedy garden. They had spent their money in my honor, not taking me away from the family. I let them cash all the checks and open all the bottles because Christmas was just around the corner, and my mother, who never resists the company of others, was about to gather the whole family around one table. I had intended to bring a souvenir of 3 sheets of paper. The invitation arrived in early December, and it surprised me. My mother had invited me to Christmas dinner with a delicious cake. It wasn't because she missed me, which is why I know her so well. She invited me for 2 reasons, and I could sense them in her happy voice. The first was the theater. This family had moved on. No hard feelings, nothing to speak of, just like the missing ledger on the holiday table. The second issue was fear. A company in town was inquiring about the property, requesting records, and my mother wanted to make sure she wasn't creating any trouble that might put her in danger. So she wrapped it in shiny ribbon and called it an invitation. She said, "You're coming, aren't you? It's okay. Let's get this over with." Then, because she couldn't contain her anger and because she didn't know how to suppress it, she added a simple reminder. "And let's not make a fuss around the house. You know, you weren't quite yourself. Don't ruin Christmas for everyone because of him." I picked up the phone and looked out of my office window at the Christmas lights hanging on the high street. I thought about asking Margaret out, the preparations, getting ready to leave the week after the holidays. I thought about the document in my desk drawer and the letter in my pocket. No one knows who will be invited to the dining room, I thought. I'll be there, I said gently. What can I bring? She had just asked me. I told her I would bring it myself. I also meant the beautiful leather pouch that was tucked away in my bag next to the cranberry sauce. I said, okay, I'll add something. Okay. I'd be lying if I said I didn't struggle with this. I talked about how to do it for a week, because the method of winning is just as important as the winning itself. I could have done it smoothly and discreetly. I couldn't have filed Margaret's lawsuit in January without any hassle, filed the documents through a lawyer, and talked about it over dinner. The part of me that Opal called my good silence was what he wanted. I felt it was more dignified, but to be honest, the reality was different. For years, they publicly humiliated me at funerals, at every opportunity. They made me look small in front of everyone. They did it deliberately because it caught their attention. The smile wouldn't work unless someone was watching. So perhaps it would have been appropriate in the same place where I had used the truth. I took out Opal's letter and read it again. Don't argue with them by shouting. Let the newspaper do the talking. My answer was in her hand. I didn't shout. I won't spill wine, or pretend, or say those harsh words I uttered in the bathroom. I'll sit at that table, as still as a pond, lay out 3 documents, and let them speak for themselves. No noise, no swearing, just the facts listed as if I were preparing a record. That week, I signed a waiver allowing Margaret to file for a reopening of the estate. The legal proceedings were ready. Dinner was the time when the family would learn the truth from me, not from the probation officer. I chose my clothes, something simple, something Opal might consider reasonable. The only scary thing about a lie is its power. Wade began to panic. I heard it myself and saw it myself. He heard that a company had requested the entire property file from the district, including the property documents and the notary's certificate. For a corrupt notary, the creaking of the floor in a house he thought was empty was alarming. Wade called my mother in a panic. I know this because 2 days before Christmas, I arrived at my parents' house, like an obedient child, to remove the poinsettias, and I heard her voice, low and sharp, in the kitchen. She whispered, "Stop calling here. No one is scrutinizing anything. You've done your job. You've been paid. Act as usual. Stop for a moment. Because if you fall, Wade, you'll break us all, including yourself. So hold on tight." I sat up straight. I stood in the hall with the poinsettia and my pretty face, putting everything else aside. So, Wade's been paid. She said it herself. You've been paid too. A notary doesn't get extra pay for honest work. The price list was posted on the wall. Wade had charged for something else entirely. Not only was the scam real, but he was starting to crumble from within. My mother was threatening him. I walked home through the Christmas lights, thinking maybe I shouldn't push him too hard. People who build their houses on lies waste all their energy on walls. Sometimes the truth is, all I have to do is knock politely and wait. 2 more days. I can wait 2 more days. In a small town, the transfer of ownership of a country house is good news, and people start talking. At the grocery store, the convenience store, the post office, people ask me vague questions, just like they do when I go hunting. Who bought Finch's old house? Is it going to be demolished? Is it the developer? Has he heard about it? I kept a neutral expression and told him I didn't know much. I felt awkward lying to neighbors who loved Opal. But then an idea struck me. I was in the hardware store downstairs from my office. The old gentleman. Petrie. I've been farming my grandmother's land for 40 years. I heard that whoever buys the Opal house will keep her garden, he whispered. I heard they won't demolish anything. Is that true? Someone at the owning company must have said so. I looked into it and couldn't deny it. I said it's true, the garden will remain. His old eyes lit up and he took my arm. All right, I said. She'll be happy. That woman loves her tomatoes more than most people love their families. Then he went back to the barn and I stood there staring. Because that's the point, isn't it? That's why I spent my savings, bought my future on credit, and set up a company with a carefully chosen name. Not to destroy my family, not even to win. I bought that house to keep a promise I made, to preserve her garden, to perpetuate her name, and to keep her porch as proud as it always was. Revenge, if you can call it that, was a side effect. The truth is simple. The man in this family remembers the woman not only because of the money, but also because of me. The night before Christmas Eve, I sat at my kitchen table and organized my file. I had done this for clients hundreds of times, gathering the documents in the correct order that told the true story. I never did this myself. I prepared 3 documents. The first was a copy of the deed. The registered owner is Cedar Hollow Holdings, LLC, owner of the country house and 10 acres of land, and the deed was written on the day of the auction. The second was a certified copy of my grandmother's original will. Margaret's seal is in the corner. My name is on the will. The house will go to my granddaughter, Simone. The third letter from Opal, handwritten, read, "Let the paper speak." I placed each one in a leather sleeve to prove ownership. The first to show proof of title. The second to prove it was meant for me from the start. The last one was because it was shaped like a heart. As they say, the heart is last. I sat down and stared at that small piece. 3 pages, 1 quiet sentence accompanying them. Pre-selected. I'd rehearsed it until the feeling was gone. That was all I needed to turn my mother's triumphant dinner into the worst night of her life. I don't think my hand hesitated for long before doing it. Once I put it aside, there was no way to get it back. There was no point in playing the peacemaker. I would be the one telling the truth, and they would never forgive me. I closed the file. I had come to terms with that price weeks ago. A few things are worth mentioning. I was asleep, and surprisingly, I slept as sound as a rock. On Christmas Eve, my father did something he'd never done before. He came to see me. As I was closing up the office, I saw his pickup truck drive along the sidewalk, its exhaust pipes whirring in the cold. He slowly climbed the stairs and stopped in front of my house, looking older than I'd ever seen him before. "Your grandfather," he began, then stopped. He tried again. "Those were documents I signed as part of the estate administration." He put his hat in his hand. I didn't read them carefully. I should have read them carefully. They were like Raymond Finch's will. I'd learned that men like my father only say the right things when they're left alone, so I waited. Wade placed the paper in front of me. Then he said finally, "Your mother told me that something was wrong. I knew something was amiss. Nevertheless, I signed." The paper was there, he knew. Perhaps not in every detail, but enough. He knew something was wrong, and, as usual, he preferred his comforting silence to his daughter. I felt the old pain, and I felt something calming beneath its weight. I didn't scream. I didn't apologize either. I said, "I know you hit him, Dad." He shuddered as if I had hit him. It was more truthful than anything I could have shouted. He stood there for a moment, hoping everything was all right, hoping I could ease his pain. I didn't, hoping everything was all right. Because it wasn't. He shook his head once, put his hat back on, and went downstairs. I saw the car's taillights go out, and I thought to myself, "You'll find out the rest tomorrow." I felt sorry for him. With Christmas approaching, I put on the lightest sweater Opal would let me wear and drove across town to my parents' house. The house wasn't far, and the town wasn't far either, probably 10 minutes from my apartment above the office to their country house on the nicer side of the school. I drove the car I'd driven 1,000 times, past the same illuminated meadows and moving snowmen, and felt an eerie calm. The file was in my bag on the passenger seat. I hadn't practiced on the road. I'd done all my training. Now I drove and looked out at the city, letting the weight of what I was about to do take on a tangible form. I remembered Opal loudly teaching me how to add columns at her kitchen table. "Simon, numbers don't lie. People talk." I remembered how many times I'd lied to others about myself and how I'd let them believe me even though I always told them what they expected. It was over. I pulled up behind Brooke's big new sports car, the one I'd bought with my own money, put my hands on the steering wheel, and sat there to catch my breath. Then I picked up my bag, the edge of the file pressing against my hand, and walked down the path toward the door where I could hear their laughter. "Before we go in, allow me to ask you a question. If you remember that a story can be more eloquent than a cry of honor, please leave a comment. As for the rest of you. So, I know you're still with me. Let's eat. The dining room was warm and bright and smelled of the holidays. The scent of pine, toasted wood, and cinnamon. My mother was busy arranging the beautiful china sets, lighting candles, and decorating the table with a red and gold centerpiece. Everyone was there, while my father sat silently at the foot of the table. Brooke and her husband Travis were drinking wine in the middle, as were my Uncle Gary and his wife. To my surprise, Wade was wearing sweatpants over a long sweater, as if he wanted to be by the door. My mother nodded, clinked her glasses, and spoke to the Queen of the Kingdom, whom she found kind. She welcomed me warmly and seated me on the right in the place of honor so everyone could see how kind she was to the naughty child. I allowed her to do so. I finished thanking everyone at the table. I passed the bread. I asked Travis about his work and admired the tree. I was, quite literally, a very pleasant guest at dinner. Inside, I was calmer than ever. We ate. We raised our toasts at the appropriate time. Then, between the main course and the cake, my mother tapped her glass with her fork and told him she had a small announcement. Family news worth celebrating. There it is, I thought. There it is. My mother rose and picked up her wine glass, and silence fell over the table as usual. What she meant was how difficult it had been for Mother Finch to lose her. She placed her hand on her chest, but we had gotten through it together. My family and I are delighted to announce that we finalized the sale of her house last month. We're done. Now we can all move on. Glasses were raised around the table. Congratulations, Mum, Brooke said. Then my mother looked at me, and her smile faded. This is what I've been waiting for. This is the kind of audience I need for my work. I know this is a sensitive subject for some, she said, turning her wine glass upside down and looking directly at me. But honestly, dear, you haven't been in a good mood at all. No need to be embarrassed. Grandma knows who's in charge. There were a few awkward laughs. Travis looked down at his plate. Dad was completely silent. Everyone at the table was waiting to see if I would cry, argue, or hide, as usual. I put down my fork. I hadn't picked up my file yet. Not yet. I looked at my mother and held a brief silence, which would have surprised even the most self-assured people. Brooke couldn't bear the silence and ran over to me. She laughed that bright, spontaneous laugh I'd known since childhood and raised her glass as if doing a favor. Don't be sad, Simone, she said. Actually, this is the best. Good, you were right. There it is again. The second knife, the one that fits. You're welcome, she said, smiling at everyone at Christmas, as if she were saying it to your sister about turkey and cake. Brooke, let's go, Travis muttered. But she just waved, pleased with herself. My uncle sat down in the chair. WDE took the water and missed the glass on the first try. I sat in the place of honor to my mother's right, and I felt the last vestige of my hesitation vanish. Both of them delivered their speeches before everyone at the table. They had made their positions perfectly clear. As Opal always did, when she finished speaking, I picked up a napkin, folded it, and placed it slowly and carefully beside my plate. Then I took the wine glass in my hand. I took a sip of wine, glancing at the table, then took another slowly. Afterward, I put down the glass and asked my mother a simple question about the manuscripts in my usual quiet voice. May I ask who you sold them to? She closed her eyes, surprised by my composure. What? I said. To the house. Who did you buy them from? She regained her composure because she loved hearing this part. A company, she said, sounding a little flustered. Cedar Hollow Holdings, I thought. An investment company. It was truly painful. The financial return was higher than we had anticipated. She gave a forced smile, and the people around the table applauded. So, of course, it was worthwhile for everyone. I repeated Cedar Hollow Holdings to make sure I had pronounced it correctly. That's right, she said. Why? It felt like a strange year had reached its climax. The funeral, the forged will, the cold car in the auction parking lot. Everything around me changed in the next 60 seconds. The candles flickered, the cake froze, and 11 people waited, not knowing what awaited them. I reached into my bag, closed it around the leather folder, picked it up, and placed it on the table next to my plate. I opened the folder and took out the first page. "This is the document my grandfather wrote," I said, and placed it in the middle of the table for my mother to read. I thought about the auction date and looked at the page eagerly. Then her eyes fell on the owner's name, and she paused. Cedar Hollow Holdings. She said she didn't understand, but her tone changed. I took out the second page. "This is my grandfather's will," I said. The original page, written by Margaret Horan 2 years ago, signed, notarized, and officially certified. I placed it next to the document. All that remained was the country house and 10 acres in my name. The paint on my mother's face had vanished, as if someone had peeled it off. Brooke leaned forward to read, and remained silent. WDE pushed his chair away from the table. I took the last third of the page and held it for a moment because she was holding it in her hand. I said, "This is the letter she gave me. It tells me exactly what she intended to do." The silence on the table was so profound, I could hear the candles flickering. I moved from the newspapers to my mother's eyes. I folded my arms and let her gaze upon me. My mother looked up from the newspapers, and for the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. So I said it in a voice as quiet as a cashier's. I said it was good. "I hope you enjoy the money." There was a moment of silence because I was the one who bought it. The words came out slowly, then gradually exploded. I said, "Cedar Hollow Holdings is mine." I framed it. I made an offer to buy it. The money you spent this fall, the mortgage, the SUV, the vacation, was mine. I got my grandfather's house back, and none of you noticed. My mother opened her mouth and closed it. Then her voice recovered, and it came out as I knew it, loud, grumbling, and angry. "It's a lie," she said, half standing, her wine dripping onto the white cloth. "This isn't Wade. Tell him it's not true." But Wade was already standing, pale, muttering that he had to go back to the door, that he wasn't part of this. I didn't raise my voice. I shouldn't have. I folded Opal's letter in my hand and looked at my mother from behind the tattered tablecloth. "You said I wasn't mentioned in the will," I said. "You were right, because you took what I had bequeathed, what was replaced, and what I was originally." The candles went out. No one moved. Silence fell over the table. It wasn't the polite silence that reminded me of a nap, but the profound, oppressive silence of a room where everyone understood something at once, and no one wanted to speak first. Brooke flipped over the tablecloth. I watched her face change as she realized the huge SUV in the car had been bought with money that was almost going to be returned, money that wasn't hers to begin with. Her hand hovered over the wine glass. My father closed his eyes. He looked at the plate as if my uncle were dictating his actions. I glanced at my sister. She laughed and said I had wasted it, so I gave her the appropriate response. I calmly told him I hadn't wasted it. I bought the only thing left in this family. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer chimed happily and foolishly, announcing the start of the second cake, and no one got up to answer. I didn't eat the cake. I folded my 3 papers and put them in their folder, thanked my mother for dinner with a politeness that surpassed any insult, and then walked home, hands on the wheel, amidst the Christmas lights. "The rest happened quickly," Margaret said, "because lies are exposed quickly when everyone sees them." Margaret filed a motion to reopen the court proceedings on the first working day after the holiday. We submitted the original will and evidence of the lie, and the court took it very seriously. The Washington State Department of Education's Notary Public Committee reviewed the case within weeks. When his will was lost, and worse still, he stopped pretending he had done anything right, the document that had brought him fame crumbled at the first real scrutiny. After the forged will was rejected, the court reopened the property based on Opal's genuine will, which he had left to me. My purchase of the property at auction remained valid. I bought the house at market price as a bona fide buyer, directly from the market, and the court would not seize a house from an honest and trustworthy seller. The money distributed to my family came from the property they sold with forged documents, and the court has ordered its return. My mother, who had spent her share of the money paying off a debt she'd hidden for years, was now drowning in debt with no way to repay it. Her carefully constructed, perfect image of the city had been shattered, which was the worst thing that could have happened to her. Brooke was forced to sell her brand new SUV to pay off her debts. My father was moved to the guest room, but I heard he was feeling very sleepy by the end. I found no enjoyment in those dreary rooms. I want you to believe that. But I wasn't responsible for that, because I didn't lie. I didn't take a single dollar that wasn't mine. But I took over the house from both sides. It happened as planned, and as required by law. The auction made me the owner. The valid will made me the heir. 2 different roads, the same front door. That spring, I drove down Cedar Hollow Road, fixed the curved porch swing, and turned over the dirt in the Opal yard with my hands. Mr. Petrie came with the tomato seedlings and didn't say much, which was a blessing. I left the door open for Dad on one condition. I told him it was open when he was ready to tell the truth. He hasn't come yet. Maybe he will. Maybe not. In any case, the garden is ready and the swing is working as usual. Here's what I've learned. She sits in that quiet house that was once hers. Her family may choose to keep you out of the story as much as they like, but those who truly stay are the ones who find the home, the name, and the truth. I'll leave it here tonight. The smile, the greeting, and the 3 cards on the Christmas tablecloth. If you're someone who was left alone when others came to your aid, this story is for you. So do something quiet this week. Before you raise your voice, think carefully about what matters. Actions, commitments, and promises. Leave a comment on the rest. If you made it to the end with me, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Quiet Drama Stories, because there's always another family, another table, and another truth waiting to be revealed.